let's start messing around with ABGs. So I'm going to make up a problem. I'm going to have to scoot my body over to right on this side, but let's say that the pH is 7.31. So 7.31. Let's say my CO2 is 56 and my HCO3 is 24. While I'm here, I'm going to make another problem down here that we can try next. So for this problem down here, let's say I'm 7.51 pH, a CO2 of 40, and a bicarb of 30. All right. So let's mess around with this first problem. So a pH of 7.31. If you look at this here, 7.31, my normal range is 7.35 to 7.45, and we're talking 7.31. So where is that falling? Is it falling on more of the acid side? Is it a normal range, or is it on the alkaline side? I'm going to let you look at that for a second. 7.31. Is that acid? Is that normal, or is that base? Hopefully you're saying that that is acidic. 7.31 falls below the 7.35. So I'm literally going to put the word pH in that box there, because that's my acid box, because it's acidic, right? 7.31 is acidic. So now I'm done looking at that. I don't need to look at that anymore. Let's look at the CO2. CO2 of 56. So when you look at your normal range of 35 to 45, and this is 56, is that acid, normal, or basic? A CO2 of 56, your normal range is 35 to 45, and now we're 56, which falls over here, right? That lands over on this acidic side. So CO2 of 56 is acidic. So I literally put CO2 in that acid box because it's on the acidic side. And now I'm done looking at that. And now I look at my bicarb, HCO3. We're looking at a bicarb of 24. So my normal range of bicarb is 22 to 26, and this is 24. So is that more on the acid side? Is it normal, or is it basic? So HCO3 of 24, is that falling within that 22 to 26 range? Yes. So I put the word HCO3 in my normal box. If any of that was confusing, pause me, go back and rewind it and watch it again. But for now, we're done looking at that. Now we get to name it. Naming it is always interesting. So if you had any issues with figuring out what those ranges were and why I put them in those boxes, pause me. Go back and rewatch it like I just said. Your pH always tells you what you're in, either acidosis or alkalosis. This chart is pretty self-explanatory with that. It's either in the acidosis side or on the alkalosis side, or it's sitting in the normal category. Before we move further, I just want to add, when we're naming it, and I'm going to write this up here kind of in my blank area for my just general knowledge. When you are talking about CO2, we breathe that out, right? There goes some CO2. CO2 deals with respiratory things. So CO2 represents respiratory. And your bicarb, bicarbonate is made in the kidney, metabolic. Anytime you're talking about bicarb, we're talking about metabolic. That's just a side note. Back to naming. pH always tells you what you're in. Always start with your pH. Once you get it in this grid, naming it becomes a lot easier. So our pH in this grid is literally sitting in the acid side, right? So I'm in acidosis because it's in this side. So I know I can call it acidosis. But now we need to figure out what kind of acidosis. Well, with this grid system, I really like the grid system because if you are looking at the grid and you see the pH in whatever box it's in, wherever your pH is in the grid, just look directly underneath it. And whatever's directly underneath it is what kind of acidosis or alkalosis you're in. So in this case, if I find my pH is sitting here, I look right underneath it, and CO2 is sitting underneath it. And what does CO2 represent? Respiratory. So this person is in respiratory acidosis. Now, compensation is a whole nother discussion. So for right now, I'm not going to talk about compensation. We're just going to do this next practice problem, and then I'll do another video on compensation and kind of circle back on this. So you name it by looking at your pH first. Your pH is going to always tell you what you're in. In this case, pH is acidic, so you're acidosis. And with this grid system, if you look directly underneath the pH, in this grid here, in this box, is the word CO2, and CO2 represents respiratory issues. So this person is in respiratory acidosis.